Arcades weren't supposed to disappear. For decades, they represented the future of video games. They had better graphics, better hardware, experiences home consoles could only dream of. That's where Street Fighter II became a phenomenon, where Daytona USA showed what 3D racing could look like. If you wanted to see the future of gaming, you went to the arcade. And then, arcades disappeared. Now, most of us think we know why. Because home consoles finally caught up, and once that happened, arcades had no reason to exist anymore. But that doesn't tell the whole story, because the slow death of the arcade had already begun years earlier. And by the time arcades finally collapsed, it was because their biggest advantages had disappeared. So the question is, what were those advantages, and why did arcades start losing them in the first place? By the late 90s, systems like the PlayStation, Saturn, and Nintendo 64 could render complex 3D graphics that earlier consoles couldn't even attempt. Once players could get that experience at home, arcades stopped being necessary. At least, that's the explanation we hear most often. But there's a problem with that story. Arcades had survived improvements in home console hardware for years. The Nintendo Entertainment System didn't kill arcades, neither did the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis, and those consoles were already bringing arcade-style experiences into the living room. Something else had to change, and it did. For most of gaming history, arcades had several enormous advantages over home gaming, and by the early 90s, those advantages were starting to slip. And the first advantage had nothing to do with technology. The first advantage was economic. Arcades ran on a strange business model. The better you became at a game, the longer a single quarter lasted, which created a very unusual design problem. The game had to take your money while convincing you it was your fault when you lost. In other words, arcade games had to be difficult enough to keep players playing, but rewarding enough that players wanted to come back. That system worked because players had no other way to practice. And that became especially important in the early 90s when competitive games exploded in popularity. Fighting games like Street Fighter II rewarded mastery, but improvement required repetition and practice. And repetition and practice cost quarters. Lose quickly and your game might last less than a minute. If you were like me, you got very good at losing quickly. Arcades weren't just selling playtime, they were selling the chance to get better. And the scale of that system was enormous. By 1993, Street Fighter II alone had generated over $1 billion in arcade revenue worldwide. But when Street Fighter II arrived on home consoles in 1992, something fundamentally shifted. Players suddenly had infinite practice at home. They could experiment, practice combos, learn characters without paying for every attempt. The process of getting better at a competitive arcade game moved outside the arcade. And once that started compounding with similar games, the economic foundation of arcades started weakening. But that wasn't the only advantage arcades were about to lose. Arcades served another crucial role. They were the infrastructure of competitive gaming. Yes, you could now practice at home, but if you wanted to find worthy opponents, you went to the arcade. Crowds would often gather around cabinets to watch matches. Winners stayed on the machine, losers stepped aside, and if someone wanted to challenge you, they placed a quarter on the cabinet. It was the 90s arcade version of calling next. Arcades created a physical competitive space. They were where rivalries formed, where reputations were built. But once fighting games and other multiplayer experiences arrived on home consoles and PCs, that system started to change. Living rooms became small local tournaments. Competition no longer required the arcade, and eventually online play allowed competition to happen without ever leaving home. The arcade was no longer the center of the competitive scene. So by the late 90s, players could practice at home. They could compete at home. But here's the interesting part. even after the arcades lost those advantages, they still looked untouchable because there was still one thing consoles couldn't match, and that final advantage seemed impossible to catch, until suddenly it wasn't. For most of gaming history, arcades had an enormous technological advantage. Arcade machines weren't designed to be affordable, they were designed to attract attention. Home consoles had the opposite goal. They had to be cheap enough for a family to buy. A typical arcade cabinet in the early 90s could cost $3,000 to $10,000 and beyond. Many of the popular consoles of the 90s ran around between $200 and $300, which tells you everything about why arcade games looked better. For example, Capcom's CPS-1 arcade board, which powered Street Fighter II, used multiple specialized graphic chips and far more memory than home consoles of the time. Meanwhile, the Super Nintendo ran on a 3.58 MHz processor with just 128 kilobytes of RAM. Arcade machines simply had more resources. So for years, arcade ports to home consoles were obvious downgrades. Players expected that. But by the mid-90s, that gap was shrinking. And then in 1997, a single game exposed just how much that gap had shrunk. In 1997, arcades received one of the most impressive fighting games ever released, Tekken 3. It was fast, it was smooth, it was detailed. It looked exactly like the kind of experience players expected to find in an arcade. For decades, games like this were the reason arcades existed. But when Tekken 3 was released on the PlayStation 1, it created a shift that was impossible to ignore. Notice this gameplay footage. One of these is the arcade version of Tekken 3. The other is the PlayStation version. See if you can tell which is which. For many players, the difference was almost impossible to notice. The gap was suddenly so tiny, it felt like the arcade experience had moved directly into the living room. That had almost never happened before. For decades, many arcade ports, although fantastic, had still in one way or another felt like downgrades. But Tekken 3 felt different, and there was a reason for that. Tekken 3 originally ran on Namco's System 12 arcade hardware, which was closely related to PlayStation hardware with only modest upgrades. For one of the first times at scale, the arcade machine and the home console were built on nearly the same technological foundation. The hardware advantage that had protected arcades for decades was disappearing. And once that happened, the entire system started to unravel. By the time the sixth generation of consoles arrived, the pillars that had supported arcades for decades were gone. Arcades didn't disappear because of a single new console. They didn't disappear because of a single game. They disappeared because the system that had supported them for decades simply stopped working. Players could practice at home. They could compete at home. And now they could experience games that looked almost identical, and in some cases even better than their arcade counterparts. Arcades had survived rising rent, dying mall culture, and generations of new consoles. For decades, they'd been the only place where the future of gaming existed. But by the late 90s, that future had quietly moved somewhere else, into our homes. And once that happened, players realized something new. They didn't need arcades anymore. And once that realization spread, the arcade era was done. So let me ask you, when did you stop going to the arcade and why? Let me know in the comments below. And if you made it this far, as always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, happy gaming, my friends.